June 18th, 1815, 7:00 p.m. The Brussels road south of Waterloo. Through the smoke and carnage of 9 hours of slaughter, Marshal Michel Ney, his uniform torn by 4 bullet holes, his 5th horse of the day shot from under him, staggered on foot toward the last intact formation on the battlefield. Before him stood 5,000 men in dark blue greatcoats and tall bearskin caps, arranged in 9 massive squares, the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's immortals, the elite soldiers who had never been defeated in battle, who had marched from Madrid to Moscow, who represented the last hope of an empire that had once ruled Europe. Ney, his face blackened by powder smoke, his voice hoarse from screaming orders over the roar of cannon, delivered the Emperor's command. The Guard will advance, for France, for the Emperor, for glory. These men, veterans with an average of 15 years' service, wearing uniforms that cost more than a common soldier earned in a year carrying weapons reserved for the Empire's finest, began their march toward the British lines 600 yards uphill. They moved in perfect formation despite the mud, despite the bodies, despite knowing they were marching towards 67,000 British, Dutch, and Prussian soldiers who held the high ground. What the Old Guard didn't know, what Napoleon himself refused to believe even as the reports reached him, was that 50,000 Prussian soldiers were already smashing into the French right flank, that the day was already lost, that their attack was not the killing blow that would shatter Wellington's line, but a funeral march for an empire. This is the story of how the most elite military formation in European history made its final stand. How men who had conquered a continent walked knowingly into annihilation rather than surrender. How 5,000 veterans faced 20,000 enemies and chose death over dishonor. And how 5 words, "The Guard dies but does not surrender," became the epitaph for Napoleon's empire. The Imperial Guard had been created in 1804, the same year Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Unlike other military units formed from conscripts and filled with whoever the draft caught, the Guard required specific qualifications. A soldier needed 8 years of service minimum, participation in at least 3 campaigns, a height of at least 5 feet 10 inches, tall for the era, demonstrated courage under fire and the ability to read and write. These requirements eliminated 95% of potential candidates. Those who made it through selection entered a parallel military universe. While line infantry received 5 sous per day, Old Guard grenadiers earned 2 francs, 4 times as much. They wore bearskin caps that cost 75 francs each, when a line infantry uniform cost 35 francs total. Their muskets were individually fitted and tested, unlike the mass-produced weapons of the line. They received double rations, better quarters, and the privilege of addressing complaints directly to the Emperor. Napoleon personally reviewed every guard, promotion. He knew many of the senior sergeants by name. He spent more time with the Guard than with his marshals, often taking his meals with Guard units, sitting on a drum while veterans told stories of previous campaigns. This created a bond between emperor and soldiers that transcended normal military loyalty. The Guard didn't just serve Napoleon, they loved him. By 1815, the Old Guard represented the last remnants of the Grande Armée that had conquered Europe. Of the original 8,000 men who had marched to Russia in 1812, fewer than 400 returned. Those survivors formed the core of the reconstituted Guard. They had fought at Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, Wagram. They had marched through snow and desert, through victory and catastrophe. They wore their service on their bodies. One sergeant of the 1st Grenadiers carried 17 separate wounds. Another had been bayoneted 5 times and shot twice. These men viewed combat as their profession and survival as their credential. The Guard's reputation for invincibility was not propaganda. In every major battle from 1805 to 1814, the Guard had been held in reserve, only committed when the outcome hung in balance, and every time they advanced, they won. At Austerlitz in 1805, the Guard cavalry shattered the Russian Imperial Guard in a charge that broke the coalition centre. At Jena in 1806, the Guard grenadiers took a fortified town in 15 minutes that Prussian regulars had held for 6 hours. At Friedland in 1807, the Guard artillery fired 8,000 rounds in 3 hours, creating a killing zone that destroyed 20,000 Russian soldiers. At Wagram in 1809, when Austrian troops broke through the French centre and threatened Napoleon's headquarters, it was the Old Guard that counterattacked. retaking the lost positions and capturing 3,000 prisoners in 30 minutes. The Guards' tactical doctrine was simple but devastating. They fought in battalion squares, massive formations of 500 to 800 men, arranged in a hollow rectangle 4 ranks deep. The front rank knelt with bayonets fixed. The second rank stood with muskets levelled. The third rank stood ready to fire over the second. The fourth rank loaded weapons and passed them forward, maintaining continuous fire. This formation was nearly impervious to cavalry. Horses would not charge into a wall of bayonets. It was highly resistant to infantry attack. The concentrated firepower of 800 muskets could deliver 200 rounds per minute, creating a beaten zone 50 yards deep where nothing survived, and it could manoeuvre. Unlike line formations that had to halt to fire, Guard squares could advance while maintaining fire discipline, rolling forward like mobile fortresses. The Guards' weapons were the finest in the French arsenal. While line infantry carried standard Charleville muskets, often worn and poorly maintained, the Guard received specially selected weapons. Each musket was test-fired, the barrel checked for true, the lock mechanism individually adjusted. The bayonets, 18 inches of triangular steel, were forged from Swedish iron rather than the inferior French steel issued to the line. The Guards' ammunition was different too. Standard French ammunition used paper cartridges containing a 69 caliber ball and 165 grains of powder. Guard ammunition used carefully measured powder charges and lead balls cast to tighter tolerances, improving accuracy from 100 yards to 150 yards, a critical advantage. Each Guard grenadier carried 60 rounds in his cartridge box, twice the 30 rounds issued to line infantry. They carried additional ammunition in their packs. They had been drilled to maintain a firing rate of 3 rounds per minute, compared to 2 rounds for line troops. In a sustained firefight, this meant a Guard battalion could deliver 50% more firepower than an equivalent line formation. The Guards' discipline was legendary and brutal. Punishment for minor infractions was instant. Public flogging for drunkenness, reduction in rank for slovenly appearance, execution for cowardice. But discipline also meant loyalty to comrades. The Guard never abandoned wounded, never left dead on the field if retrieval was possible, never surrendered except on direct orders from the Emperor himself. This created a unit cohesion that modern military analysts recognize as the key factor in combat effectiveness. The men of the old Guard trusted each other absolutely. They knew the soldier beside them would die before breaking. They knew their officers would lead from the front, not order attacks from safety. They knew their sergeants, many with 20 years' service, had survived dozens of battles and would get them through this one. This trust, built over years of shared combat, made the Guard more than elite soldiers. It made them a brotherhood. By June 1815, this brotherhood was all that remained of Napoleon's empire. After his abdication in 1814 and exile to Elba, the restored Bourbon monarchy had disbanded most of the army. When Napoleon escaped and returned to France in March 1815, triggering the 100 Days, he had to rebuild his military from scratch. He managed to assemble 125,000 men, but most were raw conscripts or recalled veterans who had been out of service for a year. The exception was the Imperial Guard. Within days of Napoleon's return, veterans appeared at recruiting stations demanding to rejoin. Old sergeants came out of retirement. Wounded men declared themselves fit for service. By May, Napoleon had reconstituted 20,000 Imperial Guard troops, though only 5,000 qualified as Old Guard, the veterans of multiple campaigns. The rest were Middle Guard with 5 to 8 years' service, and Young Guard, new recruits selected for the honour. Napoleon knew his strategic situation was desperate. Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia had declared him an outlaw and assembled 700,000 troops to invade France. His only chance was to strike before the coalition armies could concentrate, defeat them in detail, and force a negotiated peace. He chose to attack the nearest threat, an Anglo-Allied army of 95,000 under the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army of 120,000 under Field Marshal Blücher, both in Belgium. The Waterloo campaign began on June 15th when Napoleon's army crossed into Belgium. His plan was to drive between Wellington and Blücher, preventing them from uniting, then defeat each separately. On June 16th, this strategy worked. Napoleon sent Marshal Ney with 25,000 men to hold Wellington at Quatre Bras, while he attacked Blücher at Ligny with 68,000 men. The Battle of Ligny was a French victory. Napoleon committed the Old Guard in the final assault, their attack shattering the Prussian centre and forcing Blucher's retreat. The Prussians lost 16,000 men and 21 guns, but the victory was incomplete. Blucher's army retreated north toward Wavre, not east toward Prussia. This meant the Prussians could still link up with Wellington, and at Quatre Bras, Ney's indecisive leadership allowed Wellington to hold his position despite being outnumbered. On June 17th, Wellington withdrew north to a position he had surveyed the previous year, a ridge south of the village of Waterloo, offering a reverse slope where his troops could shelter from artillery. Napoleon pursued, but heavy rain turned the roads to mud, slowing his advance. By evening, 67,000 British and Allied troops held the ridge. Napoleon deployed 72,000 French soldiers on the opposing ridge, 300 yards south. Both armies spent a miserable night in the mud and rain. June 18th dawned cloudy and wet. The battlefield was a shallow valley between two ridges, 3 miles wide and 400 yards deep. Wellington's position was strong. His infantry was deployed behind the crest of the ridge, protected from direct artillery fire. His right flank was anchored on the chateau of Hougomont, a fortified farm complex held by British guards. His left centre was reinforced by the farm of La Haye-Sainte, held by the King's German Legion. His left flank extended to the village of Papelotte. Napoleon's plan was straightforward. Artillery bombardment to soften the British line, followed by infantry assault to break through. Once the British line cracked, he would commit his reserves and shatter Wellington's army. The Imperial Guard, 13,000 strong, formed Napoleon's final reserve, deployed 1,000 yards behind the French front line. The Old Guard, the 1st and 2nd Grenadiers and 1st and 2nd Chasseurs, 5,000 men total, formed the innermost reserve, the core of the corps. Napoleon delayed his attack until 11:30 a.m., waiting for the ground to dry enough for artillery to be effective. This delay would prove fatal. It gave the Prussians, marching from Wavre, additional hours to reach the battlefield. At 1 p.m., French scouts reported Prussian troops approaching from the east. Napoleon dispatched 10,000 men under General Lobau to hold them off, weakening his main attack. The battle began with a diversionary attack on Hougomont that escalated into an all-day struggle, consuming 15,000 French troops for no gain. At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon's Grand Battery, 80 guns firing in unison, opened bombardment of Wellington's centre. For 30 minutes, round shot and explosive shells tore into the British position. Wellington's troops, lying down behind the ridge crest, suffered fewer casualties than Napoleon anticipated. At 2:06 p.m., General d'Erlon's corps, 16,000 infantry and 4 massive divisions, advanced toward Wellington's left centre. They marched in columns, a formation effective for movement but vulnerable to firepower. British artillery positioned on the ridge crest opened fire at 600 yards. Round shot ploughed through the densely packed French columns, each ball killing or wounding multiple men. At 200 yards, British infantry stood up from behind the ridge crest and delivered volley fire. The British infantry used a 2-rank formation, not the 3 or 4 ranks common in continental armies. This meant more muskets could be brought to bear. A British battalion of 600 men could deliver 300 muskets in a volley. Against the French columns, packed 150 men wide and 24 ranks deep, the volley fire was devastating. Men fell in rows. The columns staggered, attempted to deploy into line to return fire, and were struck by British cavalry. The Household Brigade and Union Brigade, 2,500 heavy cavalry, crashed into the disordered French infantry. The cavalry charge was initially successful, breaking d'Erlon's corps and capturing 3,000 prisoners and 2 eagles, regimental standards equivalent to capturing the soul of a unit. But the British cavalry, caught in the excitement of victory, charged too far. French lancers counterattacked, killing or capturing half the British cavalry. Still, d'Erlon's attack had failed. 5,000 French casualties for no gain. Between 3 Sol and 6 p.m., the battle became a grinding attrition. Marshal Ney, commanding the French cavalry, became obsessed with taking La Haye-Sainte and breaking Wellington's centre. He launched a series of cavalry charges, 43 squadrons, 5,000 horsemen, against British infantry formed in squares. The charges were magnificent and futile. British squares, infantry formed in hollow rectangles 4 ranks deep with bayonets pointing outward, were nearly impervious to cavalry. Horses would not charge into a wall of steel. The French cavalry rode around the squares, taking fire from all sides, unable to break in. British artillery, deployed between the squares, fired until the cavalry was 50 yards away. Then the crews ran into the squares for protection. The French cavalry would mill around the abandoned guns, then retreat when British artillery from other parts of the line targeted them. Then the British crews would run back out and resume firing. This happened repeatedly. Ney launched 12 separate cavalry charges between 3:00 and 5:30 p.m. Each failed. French cavalry casualties exceeded 3,000. But the British infantry was also suffering. Wellington's army lost 15,000 men by 6 p.m. Entire battalions were reduced to 200 men. Ammunition was running low. Wellington's aide-de-camp, riding the length of the British line, reported that nearly every unit was at half strength or less. Wellington's response was grim. Night or the Prussians must come. The Prussians were coming. Blücher, 72 years old, had been trapped under his dead horse at Ligny and was badly injured. But he ignored his doctors and led his army west toward Waterloo. By 4 p.m., 30,000 Prussians were attacking the French right flank near the village of Plancenoit. Napoleon was forced to commit his young guard, 8,000 men, to hold them off. By 6 p.m., another 20,000 Prussians were arriving. Napoleon's strategic situation was collapsing. He had 35,000 effective troops remaining from his original 72,000. He was fighting 67,000 British and 50,000 Prussians, 117,000 enemies total. He needed a decisive breakthrough immediately, or his army would be surrounded and destroyed. At 6:30 p.m., La Haye-Sainte finally fell. French infantry, attacking for the 6th time, overwhelmed the German defenders who had run out of ammunition. This gave Napoleon a foothold in Wellington's centre, 300 yards from the British main line. For the first time all day, Napoleon had a realistic chance of breaking through. Marshal Ney, seeing the opportunity, sent urgent messages to Napoleon. "Send me troops, send me infantry. I can break them. I need reinforcements now." Napoleon's response would define the battle's outcome. He looked at his remaining reserves, the Old Guard, the 1st and 2nd Grenadiers, the 1st and 2nd Chasseurs, 5,000 men in 9 battalions, the last uncommitted French troops on the battlefield. Napoleon made his decision. The Guard will advance. The Imperial Guard had spent the day 1,000 yards behind the French front line, standing in their battalion squares watching the battle unfold. They had endured British artillery fire that occasionally reached their position, losing men to round shot that bounced across the muddy ground. They had watched d'Erlon's corps shattered, watched the cavalry charges fail repeatedly, watched the young guard marched east to fight the Prussians. Now their turn had come. At 70 p.m., Napoleon rode to the Guard's position. He gave a brief speech that survivors remembered differently. Some recalled him saying, "The day is ours. One more effort and victory belongs to France." Others remembered, "Soldiers of my Old Guard, I know I can count on you. France depends on you. Forward for the Emperor." What everyone agreed on was Napoleon's final instruction to Marshal Ney, who would lead the attack. "Take them to the British centre. Break through. I will follow with the reserves." This was a lie. Napoleon had no reserves left. The Old Guard was the last roll of the dice. The Guard formed for attack in 9 battalion squares, each containing 500 to 800 men. 5 battalions of Grenadiers, 4 battalions of Chasseurs. They would advance in echelon, each battalion, offset to the right rear of the one ahead, creating a staircase formation. This allowed each battalion to support the one ahead with covering fire while protecting against flanking attacks. The battalions chosen for the assault were the Empire's finest remaining units. The 1st Battalion, 3rd Grenadiers, commanded by Chef de Bataillon Angelais, contained veterans averaging 17 years' service. Their colonel, General Harlett, had served since 1793 and carried 8 separate wounds. The 4th Grenadiers, commanded by Chef de Bataillon Henrion, included men who had fought at Marengo in 1800, Austerlitz in 1805, and every major battle since. Their senior sergeant, Nicolas Boulet, age 51, had 32 years' service and had been wounded 11 times. The 1st Chasseurs, commanded by General Cambronne, were known as the Emperor's hunting dogs. They specialised in rapid advance and close-quarters combat. Their unofficial motto was, "The Guard dies but does not surrender." At 7:15 p.m., the drums began beating. The distinctive rhythm of the pas de charge, the charge step, could be heard across the battlefield. British soldiers, German infantry, Dutch troops all recognised that sound. The Imperial Guard was advancing. Marshal Ney, on foot after having 5 horses killed under him, placed himself at the front of the leading battalion. He carried a sword but no other weapons. His uniform was torn, his face blackened by powder smoke, but he stood straight and walked with the measured pace of parade ground drill. The Old Guard began their advance up the slope toward Wellington Centre. They marched through the wreckage of earlier attacks. Bodies lay in rows where British volleys had struck. Dead horses from the cavalry charges littered the ground. Wounded men called out for help or water. The Guard marched past them in perfect formation, maintaining their squares, their step never wavering. British artillery positioned on the ridge 600 yards ahead opened fire. Round-shot, solid iron balls weighing 6 pounds bounced through the mud, striking the Guard formations. Each hit would kill or wound 3 or 4 men as the ball tore through the packed ranks. The Guard closed ranks and continued. At 400 yards, British artillery switched to case shot, hollow iron spheres filled with musket balls that exploded in mid-air, showering the Guard with shrapnel. More men fell. The Guard closed ranks and continued. At 200 yards, British infantry appeared at the ridge crest. Wellington had repositioned his remaining reserves, 20,000 men, to face the Guard's assault. The British formed in 2 rank lines, maximising firepower. As the Guard closed to 150 yards, British officers gave the command, "Make ready, present, fire." 4,000 muskets fired simultaneously. The volley struck the leading Guard battalion like a hammer. Men fell in clumps. The front rank was shredded, but the Guard did not halt. They levelled their own muskets and returned fire. At 150 yards, musket fire from both sides was effective. Men fell continuously. The sound was indescribable. Thousands of muskets firing, men screaming, officers shouting orders, drums beating the advance rhythm. Smoke covered everything. Visibility dropped to 50 yards or less. The leading Guard battalion, the 3rd Grenadiers, attempted to close with the British line. They advanced to within 100 yards, their return fire forcing some British units to waver. For a moment, it seemed the Guard might break through. Then Wellington committed his last reserve. The 1st Foot Guards, British Guards, not to be confused with Napoleon's Imperial Guard, appeared from behind the ridge crest. They had been lying down, protected from artillery. Now they stood, and thus 200 men in 2 ranks, directly in the path of the French advance. Their commander, General Maitland, waited until the French were 50 yards away. At that range, musket fire was murderously effective. Maitland gave the command, heard across the battlefield. "Now, Maitland, now's your time. Stand up, Guards." The British Guards stood as one man and fired a volley at point-blank range. The front ranks of the 3rd Grenadiers simply ceased to exist. Over 300 men fell in seconds. The battalion staggered but did not break. They returned fire, loading and firing as they had been trained. For 5 minutes, the 2 elite formations stood 50 yards apart and shot each other to pieces. The casualty rate was appalling. The British 1st Guards lost 300 men in those 5 minutes. The French 3rd Grenadiers lost 400, but the British had reinforcements. The 52nd Light Infantry, commanded by Colonel John Colborne, appeared on the Guard's left flank. Colborne had made an unauthorised flanking manoeuvre, taking his regiment forward without orders. His last 100 men now poured fire into the side of the French formation. Caught in crossfire, taking casualties from 2 directions, the 3rd Grenadiers broke. For the first time in their history, an Old Guard battalion retreated without orders. They didn't rout. They withdrew in formation, maintaining their square, still fighting, but they were retreating. The 2nd Guard battalion, the 4th Grenadiers, now in the lead, continued the advance. They were already weakened by artillery fire and the casualties from supporting the 3rd Grenadiers. They numbered perhaps 600 men instead of the 800 they had started with. They faced the same wall of British infantry that had broken the 3rd Grenadiers. They advanced to within 80 yards before British volley fire stopped them. Unable to close further, taking casualties from 3 British battalions firing simultaneously, the 4th Grenadiers attempted to deploy from square into line, a formation that would allow them to bring more muskets to bear. This manoeuvre, difficult even on a parade ground, was nearly impossible under fire in the smoke and confusion. The battalion began to lose cohesion. Individual companies separated. Gaps opened in the formation. British light infantry, trained skirmishers, poured fire into these gaps. Within minutes, the 4th Grenadiers had lost another 200 men. Their commander, Chef de Bataillon Henrion, was killed by a musket ball through the chest. Their second-in-command fell moments later. Without leadership, under fire from multiple directions, the 4th Grenadiers began a fighting withdrawal. The remaining Guard battalions, the 1st and 2nd Chasseurs, the 1st and 2nd Grenadiers, were now committed. They advanced through the smoke, through the retreating formations ahead of them, into the killing zone where British infantry and artillery concentrated their fire. General Cambron, commanding the 1st Chasseurs, was wounded in the head by a musket ball, but remained in command. He led his battalion to within 60 yards of the British line before being struck again, this time in the chest. He fell and was captured. Command passed to his second, who was killed within minutes. The 1st Chasseurs, leaderless, under fire from 4 British battalions, finally broke. They retreated down the slope, some men running, others walking backwards still firing. The 2nd Chasseurs, advancing to support, were met by the retreating 1st Chasseurs. The 2 battalions collided in the smoke. Confusion spread. British artillery, firing case shot at 100 yards, tore into both battalions. The 2nd Chasseurs never reached the British line. They were stopped 200 yards short, taking fire from artillery and infantry, unable to advance or effectively return fire through the smoke. After 10 minutes, they too began retreating. By 7:45 p.m., 7 of the 9 Guard battalions committed to the assault were retreating. The attack had failed. But the last 2 battalions, the 1st and 2nd Grenadiers of the Old Guard, the Emperor's oldest and most veteran units, had not yet engaged. These 2 battalions, roughly 400 men, had been held in reserve during the assault. They now stood 400 yards from the British line, watching their comrades retreat through them. Behind them, the entire French army watched. For 10 years, the sight of the Old Guard advancing had meant victory. Now, for the first time, the Guard was retreating. The psychological impact was catastrophic. French units across the battlefield, already exhausted from 10 hours of combat, began to waver. Someone, history never recorded who, shouted the worst possible words. "La Garde recule, the Guard retreats." Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Infantry units began abandoning their positions. Artillery crews limbered their guns and fled. Cavalry turned and rode for the rear. What had been an army became a mob. Wellington, watching from the ridge, saw the French army beginning to disintegrate. He removed his hat and waved it toward the French position. It was the signal for general advance. 20,000 British, German and Dutch troops began moving forward. The Old Guard's final 2 battalions found themselves in an impossible situation. The French army was collapsing behind them. The British army was advancing toward them. Prussian troops were smashing into the French right flank. They could retreat and try to escape, or they could stand and die. General Pierre Cambron, despite being wounded twice, had rejoined the 1st Grenadiers, or perhaps it was General Claude-Étienne Michel commanding the 2nd Grenadiers. Historical accounts differ. What matters is what happened next. As British troops approached the last Old Guard squares, they called for surrender. The French response has been recorded in multiple versions. Some claimed Cambron shouted, "The Guard dies but does not surrender." Others recorded a simpler, cruder response. Merde. Shit. Victor Hugo, writing years later, provided the romantic version that became legend. Cambron's response to the demand for surrender was the most beautiful word ever spoken by a Frenchman. Modern historians believe both versions are partially true. Different officers gave different responses, some defiant, some profane, all refusing surrender. What isn't disputed is what the last 2 Old Guard battalions did next. They stood their ground. The 1st and 2nd Grenadiers formed their squares and prepared to fight to the death. They loaded their muskets, fixed bayonets, checked their ammunition. Around them, the French army was fleeing in all directions. Prussian artillery was firing into the retreating mob. British cavalry was pursuing and cutting down stragglers. But the Old Guard stood firm. British infantry approached cautiously. These were the Imperial Guard, the most dangerous soldiers in Europe. Even surrounded and outnumbered, they could kill hundreds before being overwhelmed. British officers called for surrender repeatedly. The Guard's response was musket fire. At 8:30 p.m., with darkness falling, British artillery opened fire on the Guard squares from 200 yards. Case shot exploded over the formations, showering the men with shrapnel. Men fell in groups. The Guard closed ranks and stood firm. British infantry, 4 battalions totalling 3,000 men, advanced to within 100 yards and opened volley fire. The Guard returned fire. For 15 minutes, the exchange continued. The Guard, in their defensive squares, could bring only the outer ranks to bear, perhaps 400 muskets per battalion. The British, in 2-rank lines, could deploy 1,500 muskets per battalion. The mathematics was simple and brutal. The Guard was being destroyed. Their square formations, designed to resist cavalry, were perfect targets for infantry fire. Men fell continuously. The squares shrank as casualties mounted. Officers were deliberately targeted by British riflemen. Sergeants fell. Yet discipline held. The Guard maintained their formation and continued fighting. By 8:15 p.m, the 1st Grenadiers had lost over half their strength. Nearly 400 men dead or wounded. Their square had shrunk from 700 men to fewer than 300. Ammunition was running low. Many men had fired their 60 rounds and were reduced to firing ammunition scavenged from the dead. Still they fought. Prussian infantry now joined the attack. Fresh troops, 2,000 strong, approached from the east. The Guard's situation was hopeless. 2 battalions, perhaps 600 men still standing, surrounded by 8,000 British and Prussian troops with artillery support. No hope of rescue, no chance of victory. The logical choice was surrender. But logic didn't govern the old Guard. These men had defined themselves by never surrendering, by standing when others ran, by dying rather than showing weakness. To surrender now would negate everything they had been. General Michel, commanding the 2nd Grenadiers, was killed by a musket ball through the throat at 8:20 p.m. Command passed to a chef de bataillon, whose name was never recorded. He was killed within minutes. A captain took command. The British called for surrender again. The captain's response was to order volley fire. By 8:30 p.m, both Guard battalions were surrounded completely. British troops on 3 sides, Prussians on the 4th, artillery firing from multiple directions. The Guard squares, reduced now to perhaps 400 men total, continued fighting. They fired into the closing ring of enemies. They fixed bayonets as British infantry approached. They showed absolutely no sign of surrender. Then Napoleon appeared. The Emperor, seeing the last remnants of his Guard surrounded, rode forward with his personal staff and the few Guard cavalry still remaining. He intended to die with his Guard. It would be a fitting end. The Emperor and his immortals destroyed together. Napoleon's staff refused to allow it. General Bertrand seized the Emperor's horse's bridle. Officers surrounded Napoleon and physically prevented him from reaching the fighting. As they argued, a shell exploded near the group. Napoleon's horse was wounded. The moment for dramatic sacrifice had passed. Napoleon's staff convinced him that his death would accomplish nothing. The Empire needed him to negotiate terms, to salvage what could be saved. Reluctantly, Napoleon rode south, away from the battlefield. The Old Guard battalions, now completely isolated, fought on. By 8:45 p.m, darkness had fallen. Fighting became point-blank and vicious. British infantry advanced to within 50 yards. The Guard could see individual faces in the muzzle flashes. Names were shouted. French officers called challenges to British officers. Some fighting became personal. Captain Albo of the 2nd Grenadiers, wounded 3 times, stood at the front of his shrinking square and fired his pistol until it was empty, then threw it at the approaching British. He was shot down. Sergeant Boulay, the 32-year veteran with 11 previous wounds, took command of a section when his officer fell. He led 20 men in a bayonet charge against approaching Prussians. They killed or wounded 30 enemy soldiers before being overwhelmed. Boulay was bayoneted through the chest. He survived barely and was taken prisoner. By 9:00 p.m, organised resistance was ending. The last Old Guard square, perhaps 150, men from the 1st Grenadiers, stood in a tight formation surrounded by bodies. British and Prussian officers approached under a white flag. They spoke with whoever was commanding the remnant, likely a captain or senior sergeant. The historical record doesn't preserve his name. The French officer, wounded and covered in powder smoke, responded to the surrender demand with words that became legend. The Guard dies but does not surrender. Whether those exact words were spoken or whether they were romantic invention doesn't matter. What matters is the action that followed. The remaining Guardsmen refused surrender. They fixed bayonets, and prepared for a final charge. It never came. British officers, recognizing the courage of their enemies, allowed the Guard remnant to retreat unmolested. The 150 survivors marched south in formation, still carrying their colours, still maintaining discipline. They were the last organised French unit to leave the battlefield. Behind them lay 45,000 casualties from both armies. 5,000 of those were Old Guard. Of the 9 battalions committed to the final assault, only fragments remained. The 3rd Grenadiers lost 520 of 800 men. The 4th Grenadiers lost 580 of 750. The 1st Chasseurs lost 490 of 700. The 2nd Chasseurs lost 450 of 680. The 1st and 2nd Grenadiers, the final 2 battalions, lost nearly 100 of 1,400 men. Total Old Guard casualties exceeded 3,600 killed or wounded, 72% losses. For an elite unit to maintain discipline and continue fighting with those casualty rates is almost unheard of in military history. Most units break at 30% losses. The Old Guard fought until physically unable to continue. The aftermath was brutal. Napoleon's army disintegrated completely. Of the 72,000 men who had started the battle, fewer than 40,000 reached France. The rest were killed, wounded, captured, or deserted. Napoleon abdicated on June 22nd, 4 days after Waterloo. He was exiled to St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would die in 1821. The Imperial Guard was disbanded by the restored Bourbon monarchy. Veterans were placed on half pay or dismissed entirely. Their uniforms and weapons were confiscated. The bearskin caps, symbol of the Guard's elite status, were destroyed. The Bourbons wanted no reminders of Napoleon's elite troops, but the memory remained. Veterans of the Guard became living legends. In taverns across France, old men in shabby coats would reveal Guard tattoos or show discharge papers. They would tell stories of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and Waterloo. The stories grew with each telling. The fighting became more desperate, the enemy more numerous, the courage more absolute. And always the stories ended the same way. The Guard dies but does not surrender. Modern military historians study Waterloo as a textbook example of how not to conduct a battle. Napoleon's decision to commit the Old Guard in a frontal assault up a slope against prepared positions with artillery support violated every principle of warfare he himself had established. The tactical situation at 7 p.m. on June 18th made the Guard's attack a virtual impossibility. Wellington held the high ground with 20,000 fresh or rested troops, positioned behind a ridge crest that provided protection from direct fire. He had concentrated his artillery to create overlapping fields of fire. He had positioned his best infantry, the British Guards and light infantry, exactly where the French would have to attack. The Guard was attacking uphill through mud, across 600 yards of open ground, under artillery fire for the entire approach, and would have to break through multiple lines of veteran infantry to reach Wellington's main position. No military commander looking at that situation objectively would have ordered the attack. But Napoleon wasn't thinking objectively. He was thinking desperately. His army was disintegrating. Prussian forces were overwhelming his right flank. He had no reserves left except the Old Guard. And for 10 years, committing the Guard had meant victory. It had become a psychological weapon as much as a military one. The sight of those bearskin caps, the sound of those drums, had broken enemy formations that were winning a moments before. Napoleon gambled that one more time, the Guard's reputation would be enough, that British troops, seeing the Imperial Guard advancing, would break and run as so many others had. He was wrong. The Guard's failure at Waterloo stemmed from factors beyond tactics. By 1815, the nature of warfare had changed in ways Napoleon failed to recognise. The Guard's invincibility from 1805 to 1814 had been built on fighting armies that were qualitatively inferior. Austrian conscripts in 1805, Prussian regulars in 1806, Russian serfs in 1807, all had been less well trained, less well led, and less experienced than the French. But by 1815, the British Army Wellington commanded was the most professional military force in Europe. These were not conscripts. They were long-service volunteers, many with 6 or more years of experience. They had fought in Spain from 1808 to 1814, learning their trade against French armies. They had developed tactics specifically designed to defeat French columns and squares. The British 2-rank line, which seemed inefficient compared to the French 3 or 4 rank formations, actually maximised firepower. More muskets could be brought to bear. The The British also had better muskets, the India pattern. Brown Bess, the standard British infantry weapon, was more reliable than the French Charleville. Its lock mechanism was simpler and less prone to misfire in wet conditions. After 10 hours of rain and battle, reliability mattered. Wellington's infantry also had better fire discipline. British troops were trained to hold fire until ordered, to aim low at 100 yards or less, and to fire in controlled volleys rather than individual shots. This created devastating effect at close range. When the Old Guard advanced to within 50 yards of British lines, they weren't facing scattered musket fire. They were facing synchronised volleys from entire battalions, 600 to 1,000 muskets firing simultaneously. No formation could withstand that. The Guard's failure also revealed the limitations of their tactical doctrine. The battalion square, invincible against cavalry, was vulnerable to concentrated infantry fire. The square's defensive formation meant only the outer ranks could fire, perhaps 200 men from a 700-man battalion. The interior ranks could not bring their weapons to bear. Against cavalry this didn't matter because horses couldn't penetrate the square, but against infantry it meant 500 men were essentially useless in the firefight. British two-rank lines, by contrast, could bring every musket to bear. A 700-man British battalion in two ranks was 350 men wide, all of them firing. The firepower differential was nearly 3-1 in favour of the British. The Guard needed to deploy from square into line to match British firepower, but this manoeuvre required time and space. Under fire, in smoke, on muddy ground, the deployment became nearly impossible. Several Guard battalions attempted it and lost cohesion in the process, making them even more vulnerable. The tactical inflexibility that made the Guard so formidable in earlier battles became a weakness at Waterloo, but tactics and weapons don't fully explain the Guard's destruction. What truly made the final assault tragic was timing. By 7 p.m, the battle was already lost. Napoleon knew Prussian forces were attacking his right flank in overwhelming numbers. His own staff had reported that 50,000 Prussian troops were on the battlefield or arriving. His own army numbered perhaps 35,000 effectives after 10 hours of combat. The mathematics were inescapable. Even if the Guard broke through Wellington centre, there were no reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The Prussians would simply envelop the French army from the east. The rational decision was to withdraw, while some semblance of order remained, to save the army to fight another day. But Napoleon couldn't accept defeat. Not after escaping from Elba. Not after rebuilding his empire in 100 days. Not with the monarchies of Europe united against him. Defeat at Waterloo meant final exile, the end of everything he had built. So he ordered the Guard forward, knowing the attack would probably fail, hoping for a miracle. The Guard knew this too. These were not naive conscripts. They were veterans with decades of experience. They could read a battlefield. They knew the Prussians were coming. They knew the army was collapsing. They knew the attack was desperation, not strategy. They advanced anyway, not because they thought they would win, but because they were the Imperial Guard, and the Imperial Guard did not refuse the Emperor's orders. This loyalty, absolute and unquestioning, was both the Guard's greatest strength and ultimate weakness. It made them invincible in battle, but it also made them willing instruments of Napoleon's increasingly reckless strategy. Modern military ethicists studying Waterloo often focus on Napoleon's decision to sacrifice his best troops in a futile attack. He sent 5,000 men to almost certain death for no military gain. The attack did not save the army, did not change the battle's outcome, did not even significantly delay the Prussian advance. It was, in purely military terms, pointless sacrifice. But Napoleon understood something about the Old Guard that transcends military logic. They needed to attack. Their identity was built on never refusing, never retreating, never surrendering. To order them to withdraw without fighting would have destroyed them as surely as British musket fire. It would have made them ordinary soldiers rather than the legendary Guard. Napoleon gave them what they wanted, a chance to die as they had lived, attacking the Emperor's enemies. The Guard's annihilation sent shockwaves through Europe. For a decade, the Imperial Guard had been the standard by which all military units were measured. They had represented the pinnacle of military professionalism, training, and élan. Their destruction at Waterloo demonstrated that even the best troops could be defeated by poor tactics and impossible odds. Military theorists studied the battle for decades. extracting lessons about combined arms operations, defensive firepower, and the importance of reserves. The French army, rebuilt after 1815, abandoned the guard system entirely. The restored monarchy wanted no elite units that might develop dangerous loyalty to a leader rather than the state. French military doctrine shifted towards standardization. All units would receive similar training and equipment. There would be no privileged formations, but the ghost of the old guard haunted French military thinking for generations. In 1854, when France joined Britain in the Crimean War against Russia, veterans of Waterloo, now in their 60s, lobbied for recreation of the Imperial Guard. They were refused. In 1870, when France fought Prussia, military planners specifically avoided creating elite units, fearing they would draw resources from the regular army. The trauma of watching the Guard destroyed had been that profound. Other European armies drew different lessons. Prussia, which would unify Germany and become the dominant military power of the late 19th century, studied Waterloo intensively. Prussian military theorists concluded that the Guard's failure proved the superiority of line infantry over elite formations. Mass conscript armies with standardized training could defeat small elite forces through superior numbers and firepower. This doctrine would define German military thinking for the next century. Britain drew a different lesson. Wellington's victory at Waterloo, achieved primarily through defensive firepower and holding ground, became the template for British military doctrine. British armies for the next 50 years would emphasize defensive positions, volley fire, and square formations against cavalry. This worked well in colonial wars against less technologically advanced enemies. It would fail catastrophically in the Crimean War, when British tactics from Waterloo were used against Russian artillery. The Old Guard's final stand also entered popular culture in ways that shaped how Europeans thought about military service and sacrifice. Victor Hugo's description in Les Misérables, published in 1862, created the romantic image of the Guard dying rather than surrendering. Hugo's account was historically inaccurate in many details. He placed Cambronne's defiance at the wrong time and location. He inflated Guard casualties. He portrayed the final stand as more organised and heroic than the chaotic reality. But Hugo's version became the accepted truth. Within a generation, French schoolchildren learned that the Guard had died to the last man, standing in perfect squares, refusing surrender. The reality, survivors straggling south in darkness, was forgotten. This romanticisation served a purpose. France, defeated and occupied in 1815, needed heroes. The Old Guard, refusing surrender even in defeat, provided them. The phrase, "the Guard dies but does not surrender," became a national motto, appearing in political speeches, military ceremonies, and popular entertainment. It represented French refusal to accept defeat, the idea that honour mattered more than survival. Napoleon himself contributed to the mythology. During his exile on St. Helena, he gave numerous interviews about Waterloo. In these accounts, the Old Guard became increasingly heroic. Napoleon claimed they had faced 50,000 enemies, twice the actual number. He said they had been betrayed by other French units who fled rather than supporting them. He insisted they had broken through Wellington's line and were winning when Prussian numbers overwhelmed them. None of this was true, but Napoleon's version became official history in France after his death in 1821. Bonapartist politicians seeking to restore the empire used the Guard's sacrifice as propaganda. They argued that Napoleon had been defeated only by overwhelming numbers, that French military glory under the empire had been unmatched, that restoration of Napoleonic rule would restore French greatness. The Old Guard became symbols rather than soldiers, their actual history buried under layers of myth. The real Old Guard, the men who actually fought at Waterloo, had far more complex stories. Of the 1,400 Old Guard soldiers who survived the battle, roughly 800 returned to France. The rest were captured, died of wounds, or deserted during the retreat. These survivors faced difficult lives. The Bourbon Restoration government viewed them with suspicion as potential Bonapartist revolutionaries. Many were placed under police surveillance. Some were arrested on fabricated charges. Employment was difficult. Being an Imperial Guard veteran marked you as politically unreliable. Many survivors concealed their service, claiming to have been regular infantry. But some found their Guard service opened opportunities. The mystique of having survived Waterloo created a certain celebrity. Veterans could work as military instructors, teaching the next generation. Some became police officers, their combat experience valued. Others became security guards for businesses. A few parlayed their fame into business opportunities, opening taverns or shops that traded on the Guards' reputation. Sergeant Nicolas Boulet, the 32-year veteran bayoneted at Waterloo, survived his wounds and was released from British captivity in 1816. He returned to France and opened a military surplus shop in Paris. He never discussed Waterloo except with other veterans. He died in 1843, aged 79, having outlived most of his regiment. Captain Albu, wounded 3 times at Waterloo, recovered from his injuries and wrote a memoir of his service. Published in 1832, it was one of the first-hand accounts of the Guards' final battle. Albu's description was notably unglamorous. He described confusion, terror, and desperation. He admitted considering surrender multiple times. He portrayed the final stand not as glorious sacrifice, but as men too exhausted and too loyal to their comrades to abandon the fight. Albu's honesty didn't fit the romantic narrative. His memoir was largely ignored. Lieutenant Jean Martin, who led a section of the 1st Grenadier during the final assault, survived with minor wounds. He remained in military service and rejoined the French army in 1818, when the Bourbons began accepting former Imperial Guard soldiers. He served in North Africa during the 1830s and retired as a major in 1840. He never spoke publicly about Waterloo, but left a private diary that was discovered after his death. The diary revealed his bitterness at the Guards' sacrifice. Martin believed Napoleon had thrown away the Guards' lives for nothing, that the attack should never have been ordered, that professional soldiers deserved better than to be wasted in a futile gesture. His diary remained unpublished for 80 years, finally appearing in a historical journal in 1920. These individual stories reveal the gap between myth and reality. The Old Guard's final stand was not the perfect heroic sacrifice of legend. It was confusion, casualties, and courage mixed with terror and desperation. Men advanced not because they were fearless, but because they were too disciplined to run, too loyal to abandon their comrades, and too proud to surrender. But even the unglamorous reality was extraordinary. No other military unit in the Napoleonic Wars maintained cohesion at 70% casualty rates. No other formation stood ground when surrounded and outnumbered 5-1. The Old Guard's actual performance, stripped of romantic exaggeration, remains one of the most remarkable demonstrations of military discipline in history. The question that haunts historians is why. Why did they fight when defeat was certain? Why did they die for an emperor who had already lost? Why did they refuse surrender when no shame attached to it? Part of the answer lies in military culture. The Old Guard had spent years building their identity as Napoleon's finest. They had privileges that required proof through performance. They had status earned through courage. To surrender, even with honour, would have negated everything they had been. They fought to preserve their identity, not to win the battle. Part of the answer lies in unit cohesion. These men had served together for years, in some cases decades. They knew each other's families. They had saved each other's lives repeatedly. They would not abandon comrades, even when abandoning them was rational. The bonds of brotherhood were stronger than self-preservation. Part of the answer lies in loyalty to Napoleon. However much modern analysts critique Napoleon's leadership, his soldiers loved him. He had promoted based on merit. He had shared hardships. He had created an empire where common soldiers could become officers, and officers could become marshals. The Guard fought for Napoleon not from fear, but from genuine devotion. And part of the answer lies in simple professionalism. The Old Guard were soldiers. Fighting was their profession. Dying in battle was an occupational hazard they had accepted long ago. When ordered to attack, they attacked. When told to hold ground, they held. That's what soldiers do. All these factors combined created a force that functioned beyond normal human limits. The Old Guard at Waterloo were not superhuman. They felt fear. They wanted to live. But their training, culture, loyalty, and brotherhood allowed them to override those survival instincts and continue fighting when any rational person would have fled. This combination of factors is rare in military history. It requires years of professional development. It requires leadership that earns genuine loyalty. It requires a culture that values honour over survival. And it requires circumstances that allow these factors to align. The Old Guard had all of this. They were the product of 10 years of nearly continuous warfare that had forged them into something unique. When that sword was finally shattered at Waterloo, Nothing like it would exist again. Modern militaries study the Old Guard as an example of ultimate unit cohesion. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst to St. Cyr examine the factors that created such extraordinary performance. But there's general consensus that the Old Guard cannot be replicated. The social conditions that created them no longer exist. Modern nations cannot maintain small elite units disconnected from the larger army. Modern military ethics don't allow the brutal discipline that forged the Guard. Modern soldiers, drawn from democratic societies, don't have the same relationship with autocratic leaders that Napoleon's veterans had with their emperor. The closest modern equivalents might be special operations forces like the British SAS, American Delta Force, or French Foreign Legion. These units share some Old Guard characteristics: selective recruitment, extensive training, elite status, strong unit cohesion. But they are fundamentally different. They operate in small teams, not battalion formations. They serve democratic governments, not personal loyalty to a leader. They are raised in societies that value individual life over military honour. They are professionals, but professionals who serve and then retire to civilian life. The Old Guard were soldiers for life. They had no existence outside military service. Their identity was completely wrapped in their unit. This totalizing military identity, which gave them their strength, is impossible to create in modern democratic societies. And perhaps that's positive. The Old Guard's loyalty was ultimately self-destructive. It allowed Napoleon to waste their lives in futile attacks. It prevented them from questioning orders that violated military logic. It subordinated their individual judgment to the will of one man. From a modern perspective, the Old Guard's absolute obedience was a flaw, not a virtue. But in their own context, by their own standards, the Old Guard achieved something profound. They created a military brotherhood so strong that death was preferable to dishonour. They demonstrated courage that transcended self-interest. They showed that humans, properly trained and led, can function at levels that seem impossible. Whether we view this as admirable or tragic depends on our values, but either way we must acknowledge it as extraordinary. The Old Guard's final stand at Waterloo has been commemorated in countless memorials, paintings, poems and histories. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is the simplest. On the battlefield of Waterloo, now a historical park maintained by the Belgian government, there is a small monument at the approximate location where the last Old Guard squares made their stand. It's a simple stone marker, about 4 feet high, with an inscription in French. Here the Imperial Guard made its last stand. June 18th, 1815. The Guard dies but does not surrender. Around the monument, the ground is still uneven from cannon fire. Occasionally, metal detectorists find musket balls and uniform buttons in the soil. The ridge where Wellington's army stood is clearly visible 600 yards away. Standing at this marker, you can understand the tactical impossibility of what the Guard attempted. The distance they had to cross under fire, the slope they had to climb, the exposure to artillery and musket fire. It was a suicide mission from the start. But they advanced anyway. Thousands of tourists visit Waterloo annually. They tour the battlefield, visit the museums, and see the monument to the Old Guard. Most take pictures and move on, but occasionally someone will stand at that marker for a long time, staring up the slope toward the British position, trying to imagine what it felt like to be a 40-year-old sergeant, a veteran of 20 battles, standing with his comrades in a shrinking square, watching men fall around him, knowing death was approaching, and choosing to stand rather than run. That choice, repeated 5,000 times on June 18th, 1815, was the Old Guard's final gift to history. They showed that courage exists, that loyalty matters, that honour, however we define it, can motivate humans to transcend their survival instinct. They died for an empire that was already defeated, for an emperor who had already lost, for a cause that was already hopeless. But they died as they had lived, as soldiers of the Imperial Guard, and they refused to surrender. In the end, the Guard did die, but they did not surrender. And in that refusal, they achieved a kind of immortality that no victory could have provided.